Betty, we can't hear you. Betty?
Good evening. Okay, I don't hear anything, so I'm not sure what's
Good
going
evening,
on.
Betty, now we can hear you, Betty.
Good evening.
Betty, we can hear
Okay.
you. Proceed.
Okay. Okay, all right. So I'm here to do employee wellness. I hope you are well. I do apologize, I was not able to come last week or earlier this week, but we'll cover this in the next few minutes. And I want to share, so I don't know if I can do that, share. Okay, I am not seeing it. Okay, I think I'll just share them with you after the class. So, so we're doing employee wellness, and it's about why it is important to take care of your employees. Last week we had a very sad incident in regards to a shootout in the courts, and so that is a conversation we need to have in regards to so the employer has a responsibility in taking care of all employees in securing their safety. And the government has signed into various international conventions, but also various legal instruments that provide the framework for people's security in the workplace. And they include, of course, the Constitution, which gives us the right to life, and the international conventions that we have, we are signatories to. And these international conventions have to do with international labor standards. They go back to several of them in developed nations, but in Kenya, most of them we signed for them in 2006. And they are to ensure labor standards, Safety and Health Act, which is the one I'm going to focus on, and then Sexual Offences Act, the HIV and AIDS Prevention and Control Act, Persons with Disabilities Act, and the Public Service Guidance and Counseling Policy, which was enacted in 2010, but more so in regards to ensuring safety, the government has a responsibility to ensure compliance. And the Occupational Safety and Health Act applies to all workplaces where any person is at work, whether that person is temporary, is where employers will be happy to compensate for permanent workers, but will say that they're not responsible for temporary employees. As employers, once somebody walks into your premises, you are responsible for their safety, because this act purpose is to secure the safety, health, and welfare of persons at work, and to protect persons against risks to safety of or in connection to activities at work. So apart from the employer being responsible for all workplaces, it's a bit limited in the sense that the employer must also have control of that workplace. So there are certain measures that must be put in place for the employer to ensure that they are going to compensate that when they are taking the risks. So for example, during COVID, many of us were asked to go and work from home. So if you were working from home and you sustained a serious accident, would your employer be liable? Anybody wants to attempt that? Would the employer be liable for such an accident? Nobody wants to attempt? Yes, they would. Yes, they would, on one hand, because they have authorized you to work from home, so that becomes your new workplace. However, there is a challenge in that this new workplace, they are not in control. So that would also be a challenge. So in certain jurisdictions, when accidents did strike at home, some jurisdictions fully compensated because they felt that they had been authorized. However, some jurisdictions compensated only halfway because they felt that they are not in control. So having control of that new workplace is also very important, and it is what we call the duties of the occupier. The many accidents that do happen, that do come to court, are in regards to transport. And this is where sometimes we have taken up the risk. So let's say an employer has asked you to go and work in County X. But for you to go and work in County X, they have provided transport. Then you choose to take your own transport. You have actually assumed the risk, because the transport covered is the one for the employer. When you assume that risk, it may mean that they may not fully compensate you, unless now you tell the employer that I'm taking my own means and they authorize that new form of transport. So some of the duties of the employer in providing health and safety is to inform all persons employed of any risk from technology and imminent danger. It's not always possible to remove all risks, so you have to inform the persons of any imminent danger. But for you to inform, you must have removed your risk. So sometimes you go to a hotel and you park outside a hotel and it says park at your own risk. Does the hotel manager or the hotel owner have a responsibility towards your car? Yes, in so long as it regards to safety. However, if you have been negligent, left the doors open, then they would not assume that risk. However, they have a responsibility in ensuring that there is a certain level of safety. If you come back and find your car having gone, yes, you can question them, because this being their property, they do have a responsibility to take care of risks like that. Now, in regards to providing health and safety, according to the Occupational Health and Safety Act, you're supposed to prepare a safety and health policy statement not to discriminate against employees or disadvantage any employees in regards to health and safety. And this is where there has not been enough enforcement. Many people with disabilities are discriminated in accessing many workplaces, either because there are no ramps or there are no sign language interpreters, or the safety precautions are not adequate enough for people with disabilities. So, for example, ensuring that there are handles in the toilets so that people with physical disability are able to use those toilets. Those are some of the things that need to be in place so that they are not discriminating anybody. So another requirement is to ensure the establishment of safety and health committees at work. And it's now a requirement that in those safety and health committees, at least one person should have a first aid certificate, so that in the event of a serious accident where the person may need to be resuscitated, there is at least somebody who can give them that first aid resuscitation. The employer, where there are places where people are working, in places where they need safety requirement, it is the employer who has a responsibility. During COVID again, there was an accident. There was a doctor who died in the line of duty because he did not have any safety gear. So the case went to court. They've been trying to settle it out of court, but the Ministry of Health has not yet compensated for it. So the family was trying to go back to court. However, I still am challenged about that case, because I'm not sure that they would have a full proof in that case, because COVID was everywhere. Yes, the Ministry of Health had a responsibility in ensuring that they gave them the safety gear. However, COVID being everywhere, would you be able to give evidence that it actually came from the hospital? Of course, there's a high likelihood that is, but the other side could actually say that it's hard to prove that. The thing that the employer is supposed to ensure is to ensure there's no overcrowding, there's proper ventilation, lighting, drainage, and sanitary conveniences. So these are some of the things that must be in place to ensure safety. Ventilation, drainage, sanitary conveniences, all those are some of the things. But the unfortunate part is that many of these are often not enforced by the Department of Occupational Safety. And that's where the challenge is. So as an employee, do you have a duty? Yes. You have a duty to ensure your own safety by complying with any safety regulations that may be there, to report any dangerous situation. So when you see certain things that could be in danger, again, it is your duty to inform the employer, and then not to fear with or misuse things that are provided for ensuring safety and health, and not to create the hazards. When the accidents do occur, there are several ways that you can get compensation, but the first one is usually group insurance policies for minor accidents. For serious accidents that may require compensation against not being able to work again, you would need to go through the work injury Benefits Act, WIBA. And WIBA has very many regulations. It's a whole act that says how people are to be paid, whether it is a limb you have lost, whether it is an arm, whether it's inability to work, whether it is an occupational disease. All those are things, and they calculate them depending on your age and, of course, your job group, to figure out how much you would be compensated for. But for that compensation to happen, there are certain requirements. First and foremost, you must show that the accident did not result from willful misconduct, and you must be able to report the injury to the employer within 24 hours. It can be either a written notice, a verbal notice. You can also give it through other of your relatives or friends, so it doesn't have to be you. So somebody on your behalf could do it. And then the director of the employer needs to give this information to WIBA within 7 days. So those are the requirements for you to get WIBA. Now, wellness programs require a holistic outlook where you ensure the physical environment is good, the occupational, the environmental, the intellectual, social, and emotional, and including the spiritual. The employer has a duty over the employee's spiritual well-being. Of course, it's limited. First and foremost, they do not need to give you a place to go and worship. That's usually done for many. I know for the Muslim faiths, many of them are given a place where they can do their prayers, but that's usually not a requirement. What is the legal requirement is to give people their time of worship. Whether you are of Islamic faith, whether you are a Seventh-day Adventist, whether you're a Sunday goer, those are the requirements. But also, the religious gown must be respected is another requirement of the employer. So if you are wearing the hijab, you're wearing the turban, if you're a Mukorino or a Karasinga, if you wear long dresses for Corinos, or if you wear, and in 2019, an interesting case where somebody was able to prove that Rastafarianism is a religion, or was his religion, so he could wear dreadlocks. So all those are things that the employer has to respect in regards to the employee well-being. Now, when an accident does occur, what is the requirement of the employer? Of course, to report and to minimize accidents by ensuring safety within the workplaces, and then have routine checkups, continuous review of existing accident prevention measures, and investigate the cause of accidents so that you avoid having the causes happening again, and having those accidents being documented and reported. And then perhaps also having safety training being done and providing protective gear, which we said. First aid boxes are a requirement, but we usually say even in those first aid boxes, you should not have medication, because many times these first aid boxes are within the custody of a secretary or a receptionist or somebody without any medical background. Should you give that medication to somebody and you're not a medical practitioner, you're not legally protected. So if they have an adverse effect from that medication, you could potentially be sued. So one of the things that I really emphasize on is that when you come into a workplace, you need to have a form where you sign two things: your next of kin and your beneficiaries. And those are two different forms. The next of kin may not necessarily be a relative whom you who you need to be a beneficiary. But I'll show you in just a moment why it's important that perhaps that next of kin be a beneficiary. Now, there have been very many complications with this issue of next of kin because many of us do sign the spouse as the next of kin. Our current dispensation now protects all marriages, and there are complexities with those marriages because many of us seem not to know what is considered a legal marriage. There are only four different kinds of marriages. One, a civil marriage, where you go to the AG. Two, religious marriage, which can be Christian or Islamic. The Christian one, again, is still signed under the civil. You get a certificate from the AG's office. The Islamic allows 4 wives. And then finally, the customary, which allows the number of wives that each culture advocates for. So those are the 4 types of marriages that are legally protected. Now, can we stay? The courts have been saying those are not marriages if you do not have the capacity to be married. So for you to show that you have the capacity, number one, if you have been in a previous monogamous marriage, which is either Christian or civil, you must show a certificate of divorce. That's what allows you now to have the capacity to be married. If you are in a customary marriage, you must show that you gave a token to the family in which you married the girl from. And since 2017, they are also asking that all customary marriages be registered in the civil registry. So again, there is now a requirement to also have a certificate of marriage. In the monogamous marriages, you do not have the capacity to be married a second time unless you can show the certificate of divorce. So many people sometimes go and do the come we stay when they do not have the capacity to be married. So in the event of an accident where you die, the children are protected regardless of whether they are they have been born out of wedlock or whether they've been born within a marriage institution. So those children can be able to get the benefits from whatever insurance that would have been there for the parents. However, the partner who does not have the capacity to be married would not have the right to have the benefits come to them. So many women today are signing their mothers as the next of kin, which is okay. However, when an accident does occur and these children are in the custody of their father, this next of kin is the first person who is contacted in that accident. And sometimes there have been delays because if this person who is the next of kin is not a beneficiary in this whole thing, then sometimes they can delay this process, which could actually, which sometimes can delay the children's benefits. So it's important that you choose that next of kin person very, very, very carefully. In thinking of if there is an accident, would your children be in been unable to get the beneficiaries. So I'll just talk a little bit about mental health, and then we'll call it a day. Mental health has been a big challenge in Kenya and world over. And I like this definition of mental health. According to the World Health Organization, is a state of well-being in which an individual accurately realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively, and is able to make positive contributions to his or her community. Now, what I like about this definition is that all of us, when we have mental health challenges, we are not able to accurately realize our own conditions. So it is other people who can point this to us. And this is where I say that we are brother and sister's keeper in regards to mental health, because the person who is struggling with mental health cannot realize accurately that they are not able to cope, that they are no longer productive, that they are no longer able to make positive contributions. And all of us are at risks of mental health. And the following are some of the factors that increase the risk of mental health. Socio-economic conditions such as income level. As an economy deteriorates, many people do struggle with mental health. So since COVID and since the economy has been a challenge in the last few years, we've seen very many challenges of people with high, with the risk of mental health going up. Of course, occupation, if you have a high stress level job, then you are at risk. A person's level of social involvement, the more isolated, the greater the risk. And again, we saw during COVID, when people became locked down, isolated, there was a greater risk of mental health. And introverts are probably the people with the highest risk of mental health disorders, because introverts have certain things that that put them at risk. They don't involve themselves socially with others as much. They tend to keep grudges, and that in itself, creates a lot of mental challenges. They also tend to be perfectionists. So their whole personality, there are certain things that make them more predisposed to mental health conditions. Then men are almost 4 times at risk than women. And perhaps the risk for men is because many men, basically men have been socialized not to talk about their problems. They see it as a sign of weakness. So many men struggle with their own problems alone, and that in itself creates a risk for mental health. When it comes to suicide, more men will commit suicide than women. Again, the mental health is higher. Risks are higher for men. And then genetic predisposition. And finally, the use of drugs or substance abuse will also increase the mental health challenges. I want to pause here and perhaps entertain some questions, and then I think I can see Dr. Mumo is already on board. Maybe I'll allow some questions, and then we can call it a day, if that's okay with you. Any questions? Yes, Catherine, I see your hand.
Good evening, all.
Good evening, Catherine.
My concern is on the, this recent case where we have a policeman who lost his wrists when he was exploding tear gas. So in that kind of a situation, what is going to happen? Because it's like, I don't know whether it is incompetence on his part or just an accident. What is going to happen in such a case in matters of WIBA? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. So I don't know all the details of the case, but what from the little that was provided in the news, he was in the line of duty. For all military police officers who are at high risk of serious accidents in the line of duty, have special insurances that cover for those kind of risks. And in the event that he is unable to work, which is what it sounded like it would be, he's no longer going to be able to work, he would be compensated through WIBA. And WIBA has various ways of calculating how old was he, what was his basic pay, and they would compensate him for his inability to work. So you would be getting your basic full pay pegged on the basic pay without the benefits, and it would cover you. But of course, they would the NHIF or SHIF or whatever police have would cover for his hospitalization since this happened within the line of duty. So that's what I assume would happen in a case like that. Are we okay, Catherine?
I'm okay, Madam Betty.
Okay, all right. Thank you. Any other question? Okay, if there are no other further questions, I beg to leave. Mr. Ochuka, I think you can take over and introduce me, Dr. Mumo, as he comes on.
Hello, sorry, thank you, Madam Betty.
Okay.
Allow me to now welcome Dr. Mumo. Bwana Mumo, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, when Mumo is done, Bwana Kamakia will join and summarize. Thank you. Karibu.
Thank you and good evening. I think I will just use the camera for the introduction, then I'll close the camera so that we don't have interruptions. So thank you for this evening. Sorry I was not able to join on Wednesday. I had communicated to the program assistant. But I'll take a few minutes to take you through the resource mobilization module, and I think it is tied to the strategic partnerships. So that should take us about 35 minutes or 40 minutes, and then it will be done. So you allow me to switch off the camera so that it doesn't interfere with the presentation. So I've been able to go through the discussion that we've been having online, and I will encourage all of us to be able to look at what your colleagues have been able to comment. I guess there are still quite a number of people who have not been able to participate. I think the structure of the LMS module is that you need to at least participate in the discussion forum. So make sure you have been able to participate. I think I've seen quite a number, but from the class list, I think there are still quite a number who have not been able to contribute. So basically, in terms of resource mobilization for the SLDP, we just go beyond the PFM processes and procedures and look at it within the microeconomic or macroeconomic context. And I know this is quite a bit of a hot topic right now in the country. Many of us will be aware of what is happening, and I think this speaks to the reality of the topic, trying to find a balance that works for the country, but also trying not to interfere with the individuals and business economic activities. And this is always the dilemma for any government, and especially looking at the nature of public revenues. By default, governments do not produce. Governments are not involved in production, especially for countries that are leaning on a capitalistic system. In communist countries or socialist countries, sometimes there's a bit of heavy involvement of government in the economy. But for capitalistic systems like ours, government waits the private sector and individual citizens to produce, then you take part of what they produce in form of taxes. So the question I had put was actually around the levels of taxation that are acceptable. By nature, taxes are compulsory or are mandatory. So when a government has pronounced itself on a particular matter, on a particular tax, you don't choose whether you're going to pay that tax or not. For example, you look at the debate around the finance bill. Once it is approved and passed, and the president assents to it, will not choose whether you pay that tax or not, no matter what reservations we have. So this is the nature of taxes in public sector or in any government or in any economy. But the fact that taxes are mandatory is not a blanket check for government to reduce all manner of taxes, because I said government is not involved in the production process. And the rule of the thumb is that taxes should not interfere with economic activities. So in as much as you want to raise taxes, you need to ensure that you don't impose taxes that affect ability of people to work or willingness of people to work and ability of businesses to produce or get engaged in business. So you must find that balance between how much you can tax, because trust me, all of us, we wake up to go to work because we want to make as much money as possible. Nobody wakes up and goes to work because they need to pay taxes. So taxes becomes a necessary evil in the individual economic pursuits, whether it's at individual level or whether it's at business level. So the government needs to find within their policy frameworks the optimal taxes that they can charge from the individual citizens and businesses, so that they don't become a disincentive for people to work. And I think that's the biggest challenge in any country. The focus and priority mostly supposed to be on the tax base, and the tax base is the number of people who are participating in paying taxes, as opposed to having few people paying high taxes. So when you talk about the tax base, governments need to find different avenues or get more people to the tax bracket, as opposed to relying on few taxpayers. And I think this is the catch that we have. Those of us who follow the official data, for example, we look at the economic survey of 2024 that was released last month. The survey indicates there are about 20 million people in gainful economic activities, but the people in the formal employment are only about 3.1 million. And then when you look at the data for Kenya Revenue Authority, the people who were able to file tax returns last year, they were only about 6 million. So that tells us there are about maybe 14 to 15 million people who are not within the tax bracket. I know some of us might argue that they pay taxes through the indirect taxes, but indirect taxes sometimes have their own limitations and challenges, especially when we come to the principles of taxation. So what we need is, and even if they pay taxes informally, the fact remains that they are not, or they do not file any tax returns, meaning that you cannot account for them. And partly the reason why we are having that challenge is because of the structure of the economy. Again, looking at the economic survey, 85% of the economy is informal, and only 15% is formal. Now, the problem with the informal part of the economy is that it's very hard to determine their revenues, their incomes. It's very hard to determine how much money they earn and how much the taxes they pay, or it's very difficult to assess the individual taxes in the informal sector. Again, the formal sector raises a lot of credibility issues when you come to the validity of that particular data. For example, when you look at some data like employment, the economic survey tells us we created 843,000 jobs, but out of 843,000 jobs this year or last year, only 122,000 were in the formal sector. So when you are told to verify the 700 plus jobs in the informal sector, it's very hard to authenticate whether those jobs really exist or it was purely based on estimation. So when the economy is much informal, it becomes a big challenge in terms of taxes and revenues for the government. And I think this is one of the major challenges that we're experiencing at the moment. There's a bit of a lot of debate about how much you can tax, but you can see from the Finance Bill 2023, the main target was on the people in the formal sector. And I think most of the other levies and bills that have been raised up, they are targeting those in the formal sector. And there's a feeling that probably these people have been overburdened. So that complicates the discussion around the 40% revenue to GDP ratio, because the question is, when you're talking about 14% as being the revenue to GDP ratio, which taxpayers are you targeting? Because if we have close to 15 million within or outside the tax bracket or are not filing taxes, it might appear that the 14% are the minority who are being overburdened. And that's why probably the target of talking about 22, 25 tax target might not be a realistic expectation. So when the economy is much informal, it becomes a big of a challenge for the government to grow its tax base. And I think one of the biggest discussion and debates at the moment is that we need to start focusing on policies that convert or move the economy from the informal to more of the formal sector. Unfortunately, we are not seeing such kind of policies, especially when you look at the budget and the finance bill. There are no clear strategies to move many people in the formal sector towards the formal sector. And probably one of the things that you can do that is to use tax incentives. Unfortunately, the taxes seems to be repelling or pushing people not to comply with taxes. And I think in the discussion, this is one of the things that has come up. When people feel they are overtaxed, one of the things they will do is that they will try to avoid taxes, and avoidance of taxes is legal, meaning that they will find loopholes in the law to minimize their tax burden. So when people feel the taxes are not high, then they are less sensitive to the tax burden. But the moment they feel that they've been overtaxed, then they become much more aggressive in terms of finding loopholes in the law to reduce their tax burden. The next thing is to do the legal thing, where people now do not declare their taxes or their real incomes in order to evade taxes, because probably they believe that they are being overtaxed. For example, people in formal employment, they feel that the tax they're paying is quite high from their pay slips and they do not have a choice around the pay slips, then it becomes very hard for them to declare their other incomes. Like if they have other incomes in side hustles, businesses, and others, then they might be unwilling to disclose those incomes. And we use a system of self-assessment. So this one becomes one of the major consequences of a taxation, where people now decide either to use the law to minimize their tax burden or simply break the law by evading taxes. And probably this is part of the issue that might be affecting our tax revenues at the moment. The other key thing that happens is that when taxes become a hindrance to economic activity, especially for businesses, within the medium and long term, businesses start relocating their capital. For individual citizens, you might not have much leeway, because unless you want to change your citizenship, and even if you change your citizenship, the Kenyan laws require you to pay taxes on all your incomes from worldwide. But from business and investors, especially foreign investors and even local investors, if they have an opportunity to relocate their businesses And this happens in the long term. We normally say in the medium and long term, any business can locate their operations from one jurisdiction to another one. And this probably is part of the discussion that is happening at the moment, where many investors and even local investors are shifting their production from Kenya to the East Africa region, and then they take advantage of the East African protocols to bring the production back. And you can see this in the economic data. Like you look at the economic survey, manufacturing is one sector that has been declining. From 2013, we were doing about 13% of the GDP was coming from manufacturing. In the last 10 years, this has dropped to 7.6%. And you look at last year's, the gross value add from the manufacturing declined from 2.6% to 2%. And when you look at the budget, this is a sector that has not been given a lot of emphasis. So what that tells us is that people are either shifting production from the country or they're scaling down their production. And I think we already have some companies that have left. Those of us who follow the news, there are at least 3 multinational companies that have exited Kenya by last month, or they're exiting by this month. I think GlaxoSmithKline had already announced they were exiting the Kenyan market by production in the Kenyan market by March and end of May, sorry. And Bayer, they were also issued a warning that they were exiting the production in the Kenyan market by May, end of May. And Procter & Gamble have announced that they are exiting the Kenyan market by end of this year. And all these companies are giving the same reason. They are saying that the operating environment is quite toxic. And probably those of us who have been able to engage and interact with business people and investors, tax has become a nightmare for them because one, the law requires very stringent compliance measures. For example, people in production and brewing, like the brewers and other people in production, where they were being required to pay or file their excess duty within 24 hours. This has become a nightmare for them because that meant that you stop production and start dedicating people to work on the tax compliance. I think in the current finance bill, this has been extended to 5 days, but still this is not enough for them because I remember there's a time the CFO for East African Brewery had said that it takes about 45 days to convert their beer production from production to convert into cash, meaning that the distribution, the logistics, and by the time the people were able to buy the products in the bars, it takes about 45 days. Yet they are required to have paid for the beer about within 5 days of their production. So that becomes a nightmare for them. And I think for many businesses, they are grappling with one, the tax compliance, and two, also the uncertainty. And one of the things that is emerging is that every year we are making a finance bill, we are either introducing new taxes or we are varying taxes that we had already introduced the previous year. And for people who are in investment and production, like for businesses, they need to plan their taxes because it's a major working capital component or it's a major cost for them. So when we're changing taxes and policies each year, it becomes quite unpredictable for them. And probably that's why they are talking about a toxic business environment. And when people are faced with that uncertainty, then it means that they'll need to eventually make decisions about where they invest and or keeping and holding the investment in a particular country. I think for me, we seem to be assuming that we are quite a unique country that people will want to stay here. But in reality, people in businesses, they make decisions for profit maximization. They don't make a decision for purpose of paying taxes. I think this is one thing that has been a major challenge for businesses. This is something that many analysts and many experts are talking about. Unfortunately, at policy level, we do not seem to be doing it. While in the medium-term revenue strategy for the government, they seem to talk about it. When it comes to the finance bill each year, it is short away, and then we're introducing all manner of taxes. We are also varying all taxes, so it becomes very hard and difficult for businesses to plan. Now, when you talk about taxes impeding economic activity, that's what happens. So the moment people cannot, or business cannot plan their taxes, the moment they cannot predict what taxes will be coming in future, then it becomes very difficult for them. and probably some other taxes have become a reality for them. Like when you look at the housing levy, and also now moving to the SHIF next month, many businesses might be wondering why should they carry that cost, and in the neighboring countries they do not have such kind of taxes. So while we might probably be targeting too much revenues, we might be hurting revenues in other sectors. For example, you look at what has happened in the last financial year, and you start looking at the micron data for the tax revenues, or when you start disaggregating the tax revenues, I know it's quite easy to hide when you're looking at the total taxes, but when you start looking at the different tax classes, for example, excise duty, you start looking at payee, you start looking at other levies and fees that have been introduced, then you realize that actually some of the tax policies are hurting other taxes. For example, for the first time, KRA is struggling to meet the targets for payee. And I think this is the first time it is happening. And if, for example, payee is not increasing or it's declining, it can only mean that businesses are either shedding jobs or no new jobs have been created, or the jobs that for people who have retired who are paying payee are not being replaced as fast as we expect. So that means that some of the levies, for example, the housing levy might have forced businesses, and I think late last year they spoke about it. The Federation of Kenya Employers said that they actually reduced about 70,000 jobs in response to the housing levy taxes, or in response to the finance bill of 2023. And sometimes the government seems to be ignoring this particular data, and actually this data is real. So when you start looking at different classes of taxes, we do not seem to be actually gaining from the tax policies. For example, you look at the revenue, government tax revenue for the up to March 31st this year, compared to the same period last year, the government only collected at least only about 142 billion. And to remember, in the finance bill, the target was to raise an additional 300 billion. So as at March, the government only raised about an extra 143 billion in tax revenues. But when you look at the disruption that happened in the economy, because what we know is that in the short term, businesses are not able to locate their capital. So in the first immediate year, you might see like the revenues seems to be gaining, but once you start seeing data from 3 to 4 or 5 years, after businesses will have made their decisions, you might actually find that these tax policies has hurt many other taxes, or it has disrupted quite a number of taxes of the economy that would have grown. And a good way to look at it is to look at the tax revenue of collected by KRA during the COVID period, because you remember in the COVID period there was a reduction in VAT from 16, I think, to 14%. There was also some reliefs given in terms of pay for people who are working, and actually these were tax cuts that were given for that period, and KRA revenues actually increased during that period. So you look at the data for the period of COVID and the revenue collections for 2020. During the time when those tax cuts were in place, the tax revenue actually went up. So that means that when you give people the tax cuts, you give them an incentive to spend, and you remove the fear of them spending. Now, when people feel taxes are high, then they cut spending or they cut consumption, and you collect taxes not from the individuals, but you collect taxes from the spending the individuals and businesses up within the economy. So when people and businesses cut spending, it actually hurts the revenues that we are targeting to collect. So this is one area that has been a complex area. The primary source of revenue to the government is taxes. If you look at this last month, taxes are still the main dominant source of revenue to the government. But when you start hurting businesses and economic activities through taxation, it becomes a major problem in terms of being able to collect that revenue. You check VAT, for example. We expected VAT to increase significantly when we doubled VAT on petrol and petroleum products, but that does not seem to happen. When you get a cluster of VAT, it's actually not has not significantly changed when you start comparing year to year and period to period. Meaning that people have actually adjusted their spending to actually cut either use of cars and motor vehicles or use of fuel. And you start looking at the related data. For example, you look at the the data from the regulator, fuel consumption has actually been on the decline. You start looking at data on motor vehicle sales, these are sectors that have actually been experiencing a decline. And probably this is because people's disposable income has gone down. They are actually adjusting and responding to the realities because they cannot pay what they do not have. And I think the bottom line here is that you cannot tax income that has not been had. And that's why you saw a lot of backlash on the motor vehicle circulation levy, because you're not taxing income, you're actually taxing the capital. And that becomes a dangerous trend when you start taxing capital and not income. Government should wait the people and the businesses to produce so that you can take a portion of that. But that portion should not be large enough to become an incentive to work. And I think for many people, they are asking if, for example, government is taking close to 60%, because when you take cumulatively what you lose in terms of direct taxes, what you spend in terms of indirect taxes, and what other taxes that are not formal. For example, many of us will be aware about the black tax. Black tax is when you are paying, you're contributing to Arambe to raise school fees, contributing to Arambe for medical bills, contributing to your relative because they need to access services that should have actually been provided by the government. So when you check the sum total of all those, they become actually total taxes. When you look at how much you spend, for example, on your motor vehicle, because roads are not well maintained, all those contribute cumulatively to your taxes. And if all these formal and informal taxes are taking most of my income, then many people might opt out of the formal economy so that they can actually start engaging in the informal economy where probably they can hide their incomes. And probably we know that most of the money in Kenya might actually be moving and circulating within the informal economy as opposed to the formal economy. And these people are not within the tax bracket. And a good case in point is, for example, those of us who know the vegetable markets within Nairobi, within Mombasa, and within the main other urban areas, a lot of cash gets traded and transacted early in the morning. And this data is being collaborated by the mobile money lenders, who say most of their lending, their mobile-based lending happens between 4 a.m. and 6 a.m. when people and traders are in the market. So it means that these markets are moving a lot of revenues, they're moving a lot of incomes, but those people are actually nowhere within the tax bracket. You might find that those people, the middlemen and the people operating those markets might be actually be earning more than people in formal employment, but those people are nowhere within the tax bracket. And you might see people now start shifting towards those informal sectors so that they avoid paying taxes. So it becomes a disincentive when people look for employment in formal sector. So it becomes a very complicated problem when we start losing sensitivity to reactions of businesses and individuals. So unfortunately, the Finance Bill 2023 was quite disruptive. It has not brought as much money as it was targeted because the data, I think the revenues that had been collected up to end of May last month, were 1.9 trillion against a target of it was 1.9 trillion against a target of almost 5 trillion. It's unlikely that KRA is going to collect the remaining shortfall of about 600 billion in 1 month. So that means that the Finance Bill 2023 did not yield the target revenues, and probably we are yet to see what decisions businesses are going to make in the coming days in reaction to that. Now, if Finance 2024 becomes quite much more controversial because now it has moved from the direct taxes, and now it has become quite punitive in terms of the informal. I think those of us who are in the education sector, most of the tax VAT that were exempt or zero rated, they have been dropped in education, in things like specialized medical equipment. So you look at the VAT, I think the bill is quite hard on VAT, and it's exposing mean that the basic cost for many things will be affected. And I think that's why the CS was alluding to that everything that is being sold in the country will be subjected to tax. So most of those decisions are actually in the VAT. I know we might be aware of the motor vehicle levy that was there, the VAT on bread, but actually, if you look at the bill, and especially the section on the VAT, almost everything that was a joint zero rating or a tax exempt, meaning that if you were buying supplies that at VAT, you had a chance to claim them back. That is not going to happen because most of the sections have been deleted for most of the products across all the sectors. I think only products that have been left to benefit from either zero rating or tax exemptions are on agriculture, especially fertilizer and a few supplies. So that means that come July, many of the products that probably were enjoying certain benefits in terms of VAT will lose those benefits. And I think that's why you've seen the protesters raising up all these issues. Actually, it's a reality. And probably we do not know whether it will going to bring the 302 billion being targeted. Finance 2023 did not bring that money, despite the levies that have been introduced and the taxes that were introduced. And the question is, where will Finance Bill 2024 raise the taxes from? So I think this is something we are yet to see. And I think we will see when the bill is passed. If it's passed this week and it's signed, the data does not seem to be supporting the tax measures that were put in Finance Bill 2023. It's unlikely that they will benefit the tax revenues in 2024 because unless something has changed in the economy, then probably we might have reached the limits, and more taxing might actually hurt the economy more. In terms of alternatives, I see many of us had proposed issues like public-private partnerships, their privatizations, their use of natural resources and national assets. These are quite innovative avenues that have been produced within the financial engineering system and within economics. So there are quite a lot of alternatives that we can use to raise revenues, which are a bit much friendly. Unfortunately, these things we call public-private partnerships, project financing, and other measures that are actually good in many other economies, in Kenya, they seem to be having negative consequences because we don't seem to be careful on what we sign and what we commit. Like you look at a case of one of the popular things that is being used is public-private partnerships. Now, these are quite good and innovative initiatives within the financial engineering space. But in Kenya, where we have signed PPPs, they have actually become more detrimental because of the clauses and the provisions that we look at. For example, when you look at the energy sector, most of the bills that we are struggling with and the cost of energy is actually because of PPPs that have been signed with the private partners, where we know the agreements are signed in favor of the private partners, not in a balanced way to share the benefits and cost of the PPP. The nature of PPPs is that the private sector should bring the capital investment largely in technology and efficiency in management of public services. But the government should also be able to protect public interest in the sense that while the private sector need to recover the investment, then you cannot sign an agreement that hurt sectors. And you've seen, for example, many of the PPs that we have signed in the energy sector, they are selling energy almost 1,000 times what the national generator Kengen sells to the Kenya Power, and all those costs are loaded to the consumers. So this one sector where we know that PPPs are actually not working, and not because they are bad per se, or not because the concept is bad per se, but because the people who signed them, they signed them to advance private interest, not to protect public interest. And another good case in point is the expressway. I know many of us have heard it's a PPP, but when you look at the toll act, when the toll bill was being amended, the nature of that road is that the private investors should recover. In a good PPP, the private investor should collect the money from the road and recover its investment, and also get some margin for a given duration of time, after which the road should refer to the public sector. But when we were passing the toll bill, you can check regulation, I think section 18. In that section, the government committed that whether the road collects money or not, the government will pay the contractor out of ordinary revenues. So what that means that it no longer ceases to be, it is no longer a PPP, because government assumes total risks of that project. So whether people use the road or not, it means that if the contractor is not able, or if the operator is not able to recover the investment, then you'll have to use tax money to pay him for the difference. And I think that now negates the concept on the principle of sharing benefits and cost and risks. It's the same case that is happening in the housing, the controversial housing, affordable housing schemes and programs. When we say we are de-risking the private sector, for example, government gives these private investors public land, free public land. They waive all the levies, they waive all the taxes, and all the material they're using are tax exempt. And yet, once those houses are completed, the government buys out the houses from the private sector in what we are calling de-risking. In that sense, it means that the private sector assumes no risks at all. They simply are guaranteed a benefit, meaning that you use taxpayers' money to cash out the private investors, and then they assume no risk. That's not how PPPs work. For example, if the government de-risks them in terms of cost of land, taxes, permits, and all that, then the private sector should be able to take the risk of selling the houses in the market. Government should not buy the houses, because when the government buys out the houses from them, it means that them they will lose nothing, or they'll have risk for nothing, and it becomes very good business for them. So when you talk about PPP, it's a quite innovative approach to mobilizing revenue from governments. It has worked very well in countries like India. It's done very well in Malaysia and countries like Australia and other Far East countries. But in our case, PPPs are used for probably defrauding, if I could say that, the government, in the sense that it serves more of private interest as opposed to public interest. So that's a very good avenue. We have heard about privatization. I think those of us who remember the Kibaki administration raised a lot of money through IPOs. You remember the Kenyan IPO, the Kenya Re IPO, the Safaricom IPO. All these raised billions of shillings for the government. Unfortunately, in the last 10, 12 years now, we have not had any single listing in the stock market. And the transaction where the government has gone through the direct privatization way, most of those privatizations are bogged in controversy. And I think I will not need to mention specific cases, but we're already aware of some of the controversies that have brought direct privatization. So while these are very good avenues to raise revenues for the government, if our values continue to be and integrity continue to be in question, then PPPs, private partners, PPPs and privatization programs will remain a mirage that might not benefit the country as it was. But where they work, they are actually very good avenues outside taxation where you can profit a lot. In very rare cases, government get involved in business. Where we have state agencies that are in commercial, like Kenya Airways, we have Kenya National Oil. Unfortunately, those state agencies have become conduits. They rarely make profit for the government. In many other countries, state agencies pay government dividends in terms of billions. In Kenya, I think those state enterprises have become agencies that are perpetually being bailed out by the government instead of paying the government billions. And we actually end up losing a lot of money through that. And probably the largest and the biggest source of income for the government will be what most of you have already alluded to. We are told that the country loses about 1/3 of its budget through budgeted corruption, meaning that when we are talking about the budget of 3.92 trillion, we know a big component of that is part of what is budgeted for corruption. Because if you understand the Kenyan public and legal instruments, you cannot perpetuate corruption unless you first plan for it, get it funded in the budget, and then wait for the budget to be approved, and then you execute it. So we know out of that budget, if the laws are working, if the planning system is working, the budget system is working, then part of that budget is also what has been budgeted for corruption. And there will be quite a lot of conservative estimates. Some people talk about 30% or one that. There's a time the former head of public service, Kinyo, when he was at Treasury, there's actually a time he said about 45% of the budget is what goes to waste and outright corruption. Now, the question that we have been asking and many experts are asking is, why don't use taxes that probably you target to collect? Like you look at the motor vehicle levy, it was targeted to raise only 58 billion. But if it's true that one third of the budget goes to waste, then you're talking about close to 800 billion being wasted in either bogus spending programs or being stolen in inflated project costs. So why introduce a tax that is so disruptive to the economy to collect 58 billion when probably you're losing much more in budgeted corruption and waste? And I think this is where the elephant is. For example, when you talk about the finance bill, the argument is that if you don't want us to raise the taxes in finance bill, then how do you expect us to fund the budget? The issue is that if the budget is already budgeted for corruption, it means that you have already inflated a lot of money into the budget itself. And that means that part of what you're planning to correct is also being planned to be stolen or be lost in waste. And also it complicates things because part of what you're planning to spend is also financed through debt. So it means that you're also borrowing part of the money that is borrowed is actually also stolen in corruption and others. And that's why you can see us having a very complicated matrix, struggling to raise revenues, yet you are leaking and losing a lot of revenue through either extravagant waste or non-priority expenditure programs. This data is actually quite real when you start looking at the Controller on Budget report. And I think those of us who are here who are interested in understanding exactly how the government spending programs are happening, you could check the Controller on Budget report for the last 3 months. You can check how much has gone to travel, domestic and foreign travel. Unfortunately, the people are supposed to be providing oversight are the highest consumers of this travel. We have spent close to 20 billion in under 9 months on local, domestic and foreign travel alone. We have had a lot of controversies about the Article 223, where you are allowed to use money outside budget. This has been a controversy right from before 2022. During the BBI, it was the same process that was used to fund BBI. There was a lot of withdrawals done during the campaign period around that particular article. Some were being put as subsidies to maize, to petrol and all that, and a lot of money was spent. Actually, that's a spending outside budget. If you look at the last 9 months up to March 2024, the requests actually under that particular article were close to 65.2 billion. And you look at some of the things that were being requested, actually they were being requested to buy motor vehicles and other things. So most of the requests were actually to buy motor vehicles, meaning that you're using that particular article, which is supposed to target unexpected events like what happened during the flooding. But actually people are using that window to actually raise, to pick money to buy vehicles, to buy furniture, and other basics that should have been anticipated. So that's another big loophole. And we are saying, why come up with very punitive taxes if the money is just going to be stolen or going to be wasted in non-priority areas? Why don't you focus on curbing the waste and corruption, save all that money and put it into the productive side of the economy? Probably the biggest discussion here is, are we putting money to feed the cow that is producing the milk? And if you look at the finance bill, you look at the 2023 finance bill, you look at the 2024 finance bill, there's nothing that has been given to the economy to boost production. Because what you give to the economy to boost production is either stimulus packages or incentive that encourage people to invest, incentive that encourage businesses to to employ, and incentives that encourages people to comply with tax payment. Now, the finance bill of 2023 did have that. The finance bill of 2024 does not have such incentives. So that means that while people are being pushed to pay more, there is nothing that they are getting in return. And I think this will be probably a big challenge for the government. Sometimes tax cut might generate more than raising taxes. And I think it's not true that we are completely hopeless. If we could focus on the carbon waste and corruption, probably we could free billions of shillings that could go to either subsidies or either projects that inject money into circulation. I think what we call GDP is money in circulation. And economy grows when there's enough and adequate money in circulation. Economy grows when people have confidence in the economy, because in that case, they are able to spend, they are willing to invest. They do not invest and they do not spend when they have fear. And I think what the finance bill is doing is to instill more fear on the people. So probably it might hurt government revenues in the long term. So probably that's what I'll summarize in terms of the discussion. I think quite a lot of these points that come up in the discussion forums, you could take some time and go through them. So I'll take a question if there's any at this point. Any question or comment? Could use the chat or you raise up your hand. Any question or comment? Is it?
Yes, Professor.
Yes,
Hello.
yes. Hello. Yes, go ahead.
Mine is a quick one. My name is Abdullah Hussein.
Yes, Abdullah.
I've heard you talk about so many things concerning the tax regime and runaway corruption, companies closing down in Kenya and leaving the country. I mean, what is the role of Kenya School of Government in terms of maybe educating even the key stakeholders in this particular industry? Do they actually listen to you guys, or do you have a role specifically? Because I feel like if they could listen to some of these programs, I think some of those rash decisions will not be made.
Thank you, Abdullah. I can take another one.
Yes, my name is Faith.
Faith.
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I have listened to the lecture on the issues of taxation and the regime on the effect that it's having on our nation. My question is, would you kindly comment on IMF? Is it the one that is giving pressure on governments to impose some of these taxes? And if it's so, how can it be avoided?
Okay, thank you. Any other question so that I respond to them together? Any other question so that I respond to them together? Okay, I think I will respond to those two. Now, Abdullah, I think you're asking the role of Kenya School of Government and whether they listen. At least I've been doing this particular session from 2017 when it was introduced. And many of our participants are strategic people in strategic locations. Sometimes the technical and political perspective seems to be different. And eventually, the politicians might have their way when you advise them and they do not listen. Sometimes you might not do much. But what I feel is that we should be persuaded more by the data, because we can see the data. So if you look at the finance bill, and that's why I spoke about finance bill 2023, if you check 9 months of the 2022 and 9 months of 2024, the difference was only 142 billion. The bill itself is targeted to the new tax measures were targeting to raise over 300 billion, meaning that all the levies and the taxes that we reduced did not actually achieve that target. Now it becomes ironical when now we go harder in Finance Bill 2024, because we should actually learn from the issues that were raised up in 2023, and they don't seem to have yielded the tax targets. KRA had already given projection that they were going to miss tax revenue by 300 billion. As per the data that we have up to last month, which was the 11 months of the year, they are most likely going to lose the target by more than either 400 and or 500 billion. It's unlikely that in 1 month they're going to collect that target revenue. So the data is actually speaking. When employers come and tell you that they have sacked 70,000 people, why are you doubting them? And they're telling you they have sacked because of those bills. I think when the Association of Manufacturers and Employers, when they went to the finance bill, they're actually giving you accurate data. Now, these are the investors and these are decision makers. And I said that nobody wakes up to put a business so that they pay taxes. People put businesses because they want to make profits. None of us wakes up to go and act so that we can pay taxes. We work so that we can get our livelihood. So the moment tax becomes such a huge burden, then people are likely going to make appropriate decisions. And I think one of the big assumptions we'll be making is that when you introduce these punitive taxes, you assume businesses and consumers do not have a mind to make decisions. And I think what has happened this last week actually demonstrate that the taxpayers have a mind and they have actually ability to respond to tax policies. And I think to me, if you're introducing taxes that are going to disrupt economic activity, then they are no longer productive taxes. So probably we need to think about this, but also we need to remember we are the decision makers. SLDP has very senior people. From the list of the people in this class, there are many people who are in very strategic positions. So I think we need to start interacting with data and the accurate economy more. Probably it will make a bit of sense. We can have policies that are more productive. I would say we can look at the data for the COVID period. Tax revenues actually increased despite the tax cut on VAT and the tax cut on pay. So why can't we learn from that? And we saw, for example, we look at the period of 2003 to around 2007 when the tax revenues grew very fast. Because when Kibaki came, country was collecting about 220 billion. Within a short time, they had been able to double that tax. Actually, you check that period, you found Kibaki gave a lot of tax incentives. They gave stimulus packages. They introduced the youth fund, the women fund, and all those programs that were injecting money in the economy. And the tax revenues were able to grow very fast. So I think we can learn, we can look at the data and respond to it. On the question of IMF and World Bank, we know most of the disruptive policies that happened in late 80s, in most of the 80s and early mid 1990s. You have heard about the stimulus economic packages, the structural adjustment programs. We know they actually disrupted many economies, and there's already a report that was done by World Bank in 1989, where they found SAPs did more damage to more economies than benefit. For example, the components of cost sharing, they locked out many people or many children from accessing school, cost sharing in hospitals, limited access to health services. So there was a bit of evidence that SAPs did more damage. For us to bring it home, you remember during that period for about 10 years, government enforced unemployment, and they did retrenchments in 1990. And what happened around 1995, what happened is that the government for those 10 years were not recruiting people. They were not even replacing the ones who had retired. And that's why to this date we are struggling with employing teachers, because no matter how much number you employ, the 10-year period had created a huge gap that is very hard to complement. In the health workers, for 10 years, they were not being employed. The retired one, the ones who are exiting service were not being replaced. Many of the young people who were in service that time, they opted to get the golden handshake and go to private business. Many of them became entrepreneurs because they already had connections in government. So some of the social problems we are struggling with today actually are associated with the SAPs. So World Bank and IMF advocated from SAPs up to 2014. Sorry, up to around 2018. Unfortunately, they have reinstated them. So that's why we have many people are feeling that some of the taxes are not really aligning to reality within the country. But unfortunately, when we go for loans from them, it seems part of the loans that we are signing from these multilateral agencies, they are the ones that they are touching those components of taxes. Like look at the turnover tax. Turnover tax is associated with some of the loans that were taken from IMF and World Bank. Even these 16% VAT on petrol and petroleum products is also associated with the part of the loan that we took. Unfortunately, for those of us who are within the economic space, we don't seem to have any country that was able to move from poverty to development or to become either high middle income or become a developed country through IMF and World Bank programs. If somebody knows any country that was able to achieve that, then they could share. I don't know any country. Most countries that have been able to move from poverty to development because they found their own unique solutions to their own unique programs. So some of these taxes are actually probably to many of us seem to be externally driven. They don't seem to reflect reality. Thank you. Unless there's another question or comment, I'll need to return the program to CS Ochuka. Any question? If there's no question, I return it to CS Ochuka.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Momo. Kamakia, are you here? Dr. Kamakia?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, now you just wind up, eh?
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So I guess it has been a long evening. I think having covered 2-3 sessions, so just be quite a little bit brief with the environmental governance. Yeah. So the case for the environment and by extension climate change, I think is not new to everybody. We are just recovering from the huge floodings that have actually thrown the country, causing a lot of damages. You can imagine the kind of costs that will cost the country. For the next, I think, a few years, we could not even maybe now come up with development projects. Maybe we might have to repair the infrastructure and others that actually were destroyed because of climate change. And so climate change is a global conversation. It's not only Kenyan. And Kenya is part of the globe, so we need all the countries actually have to give impotence to this conversation, so that as a globe, then we don't realize maybe 2 steps forward and then but 5 steps backward. Yeah. So the philosophy behind the climate change that we see that now the earthquakes will not say these are godly people, we shall not strike. They will still strike under the factors, okay, and even droughts and floodings will still strike because the factors that they bring balance and balance out the ecosystem then have been tampered with. And this is why now you're seeing environmental governance should be key. Yes, and of course about all these world conferences that actually discuss some of these issues. Maybe that's a story for another day, because also commitments from the biggest polluters has not been honored. They pledge 100 billion because Africa is by large very innocent. But of course, the most polluting countries, we know them, are led by China, and maybe the US and Europe. But of course, some of those pledges are never honored. And that is a story for another day. But all in all, yeah, we live. There have been, at least strategies or attempts to actually caution the economies of and also the infrastructures of developing countries through grants from some of these countries. Okay, so it is not all bad, but they actually should do more because all these droughts and the climate issues we are now experiencing actually for Africa, it is very, very innocent. It's only that you cannot domesticate weather. You say this is Kenyan clouds, Kenyan weather, and this is Canadian weather. You cannot do that. Yeah. So then we must now coming back to the small things about environmental governance. So we have uh, the sustainable, what you call sustainable development. Okay. And actually, sustainable development means a balance between a social, okay, we need social progress, we need environmental progress as well. We also need economic progress as well. But then all these things must balance out. If you focus on one a lot, leaving the others, then that's a problem. If you negate all of them, that is also a problem. Yeah, yeah. So we need to take care of the environment. We need to take care of social progress. Okay, which means also projects. Projects are implemented across the country by governments and also private sectors. Actually, this is why there's a requirement that a NEMA must, you must get a license so that a NEMA can check that environmental governance has been, factored in. In the past, people would even empty sewage water and throw garbage in the streets because for them, collecting garbage is a cost, or coming up with a proper wastewater disposal facilities is also a cost to the company. So why not dispose off to the rivers? So that one at least is not happening anymore. At least we have the environmental institutions like NEMA in Kenya who have become very, very vigilant, unlike in the past when this sometimes happens. And even when NEMA is on the lookout, of course, we must agree that we have gone to estates, especially these low and level estates, where you find still wastewater. Landowners are still disposing of wastewater to the road or small rivers, and of course this is a gap for our institutions, more so NEMA. They should actually be more vigilant, and I'm also aware that actually we are changing the NEMA law to make it a little bit stronger, and even a second policeman, because enforcement, NEMA say they usually check, but enforcement is an issue because they don't have their own police, people to enforce. I think a change of law will ensure that then they can be able to enforce, so that now these practices, because in the end, this wastewater will go and contaminate swamps. Okay, swamps play a very key role in our ecosystem. The weather eventually will be affected, and then now, the reactions. Some of the reactions is drought, floodings, earthquakes, and other things. So all in all, we are saying we must keep a very close eye to our environment. Okay, how we manage environment, and I must say that as per the law and also in Kenya, sometimes we only think we should check on the projects, that when your ministry is undertaking projects, then you should get an NEMA certification, the certificate to enable you carry out the project. But there is another area we call strategic environmental assessment, which checks policies and also programs. Remember, programs like the national voter registration and the voting exercise is not necessarily a project, is actually a program. And some of these programs can also cause environmental issues. Like, for example, where do they dispose all the ink used during the vote, and the waste ink, and also the residue ink? Where do they dispose, other materials that would be, and electronics? electronics is also another area where their disposal, okay, is now a challenge because actually the world is becoming, everything is now electronics, computers, phones. People are changing phones after 2 or 3 years. So what happens to then phones? How are they being, disposed? Yeah, so there we have quite a number of strategies for actually ensuring environmental sustainability. There is even a new regulation, extended producer responsibility, where why do, for example, producers of water keep, buying new bottles of water to actually bottle the water and then bring to the market? Why can't they recycle the old water bottles? Sometimes you find that in hotels, the water bottles are still very, very intact. Okay, just a matter of washing, relabeling, and then restoring the water. So that recycling economy is also encouraged because the world doesn't have to use extra energy to actually produce another water bottle and thereby contribute to the pollution in our environment. So you find that yes, we need factories, we need industries, but then we must balance, the need for environmental governance. I mean, the question is usually, is there something that or directions or strategies that then these factories or productions of goods and services can take, okay, which can consume less power, okay, then produce less pollution. I think, by looking at it that way, then environmental governance can be controlled. Yeah. So, and also a discussion I had with the current face-to-face SLDP is that also, uh, uh, sustainable development is a balance between economics, social, and environment. Okay, but then also doesn't mean that we also protect the environment too much. Okay, it was a debate out there, and we've seen that if, for example, we are just using a small proportion of Nairobi National Park to put up SGR, and the contractor used pylons, long pylons, to actually mitigate the environment, then that is already a demonstration that environmental uh, you know issues have been mitigated. Okay, if we for example, use rivers, okay, and lakes to dam the water for use in irrigation. You see, we cannot keep speaking about, I don't know, very important species that are going to lose their existence, okay, because we also, even as humans, we also need water, to irrigate our systems and also grow crop food for ourselves. So it's a balance, okay? It's not easy, okay? You sometimes it even involves close boundaries. Like, for example, why should one country use the Nile? Okay, yeah, it can actually be shared. Okay, yeah, and the downstream countries can only use the Nile to generate electricity, and then now Egypt can now use it for irrigation, or yeah, that kind of yeah. Looking at it. So it's a balance. Sometimes these decisions are not simple, but then they looking at the facts. Okay, and this is why we have environmental as a fully French science to look at all these facts and actually contribute to good decision making. Yeah. So I guess it's already 8. Yeah, and if then is there a question before we add back to your coordinators here, Ochuka? Do you have a question? Okay, yeah. So I'm sure you're tired because it's from 6. Okay. Yeah, so thank you very much, and also apologies for not making it last week. It was because of that small things, small commitments here and there that called for our 100% attention. So thank you very much, and back to you, CS Ochuka.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Kamakia. We end it here and request that we meet tomorrow at the same time, 6 to 8 members. I want to end it here unless there's a burning question. Can we say good night? Members, are you there?
Yes, we're here.
Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
we are.
Have a very
Yes.
good night. We meet tomorrow, 6 to 8.
Good night. Good
Can we
night.
postpone tomorrow's class?
You want to postpone tomorrow's class?
Yes.
Postpone
No.
No.
Don't postpone. Please share.
We are
content.
preparing for Mandamano, please.
But
We
Mandamano
want to
is
buy
on
t-shirts.
Tuesday.
We want to buy t-shirts. We want to buy so many
Mandamano is
things
for
for the
Gen Z.
Mandamano. Mimi ni Gen Z in the heart.
I think we agree that we have it tomorrow.
All right. Thank you,
Yes,
Same
Mwalimu.
time.
please.
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank
please.
you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Good night.
Bye. Good night.